Hello and welcome to Comic Boom, the Comics and Education podcast. If you're interested in hearing a little bit more about the crossover between comics and education, then this is the podcast for you. My name's Lucy Starbuck Bradley, and each week I'll be joined by a fellow educator, an academic, a librarian, or a creator of comics to discuss their journey into comics and provide some inspiration to influence your practice. And hopefully also along the way shine a light on some titles that you can bring into your libraries and classrooms. Today I'm joined by Jess Bradley and Mo O'Hara. Jess is an illustrator, a comic artist and a writer living in Devon with her husband and son. She draws and writes for the Phoenix comic and has appeared in over 300 issues. She also writes weekly for the Beano and has done lots of other things. I'm sure you're very familiar with Jess's work. In 2021, she won a Blue Peter Book Award for her work on A Day in the Life of a Pooh, a Gnu and You. Mo O'Hara is the New York Times bestselling author of My Big Fat Zombie Goldfish. She writes picture books like More People to Love Me and Romeosaurus and Juliet Rex. Together, Jess and Mo are the writer and illustrator duo behind the laugh out loud graphic novel series Agent Moose. It was really, really fun to have two creators together on the show. It's actually something that's going to happen a few more times this series of Comic Boom, and I've really enjoyed every recording where we've had collaborative duos together talking about their work. It's been really, really interesting for me, and I hope you find it interesting too. It was great to talk to Jess and Mo about the Agent Moose series. It's so popular in schools, definitely something that children just gravitate to in the classroom and in their reading for pleasure time. So definitely recommend it. Here's what Jess and Mo have to say. Hello, Jess and Mo. Welcome to Comic Boom.
Hello. Thank you for having us.
Hello.
It is really exciting to have you here. And we were just chatting beforehand and I was saying that this is the first time we've had two guests at once on the podcast. So it was very exciting to be able to talk to a collaborative team. I will do my best to direct questions at you and let you know who I'm asking, who I'm asking what, but do shout if at any point you're like, who is she talking to? Let's start with Mo to begin with. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey as a comics reader? Is a comic something that you read as a child, or this something that you got into when you were a little bit older? Where did that all start?
I definitely read them as a kid. My brother was an obsessive DC Comics fan. So there were a million DC Comics in our house. And so I got to read the ones that he deemed it was okay that I could read.
Shareable.
And not because of content, because I would mess them up as his younger sister. So anything that he wanted to keep in mint condition was put in its plastic envelope and I never saw it. But all the other stuff I got to read. And I got into big into superheroes and sci-fi.
That's really interesting.
So that was my main comic stuff, with a little bit of Archie comics and stuff thrown in there, but mostly kind of superhero and sci-fi.
So what drew you to them? Was it the kind of the storylines, the artwork? What was it that pulled you in, do you think?
Yeah, I found it. I mean, I was never that good at drawing, although Jess has showed me some really cool things. So when I do Agent Moose assemblies now, I do draw and I try to go, look, if I can do this, then
brilliant.
You can do this. So it's a good thing. But yes, I was just in awe of what they could convey in the artwork and how much more fun it was to read than going through a straight book. And I think, especially when I was a young child, it was very daunting having a very thick read.
Yeah.
You know, you get a book home from school, you'd be like, oh, it's so big. And, you know, once I get into it, I'd be fine. But a comic book was never daunting. A comic book was always like, I'm going to tear through this because I want to see what's happening. And it just led you from panel to panel to panel to panel in an exciting way. Very filmic. I think I was a big film and TV buff too. I had a varied story diet, I like to say. I got my story from all different sources. So it reminded me of watching films, and that's why I get into it.
Yeah, I feel the same way actually. When I read a comic, I think of it like a little film in my head. Like I make that kind of little my own film from it.
And we were always given the annuals at Christmas and stuff, so I kind of, those were sort of always on hand. And then our local news agents used to be pretty good, and we had they had like Whizzer and Chips, Buster, and then when those two kind of, I think they sort of fizzled out, there was a thing called Big Comics Fortnightly, which collected a lot of the older stuff, and I used to get that a lot as well. And then me and my brother became quite obsessed with X-Men in the sort of early-ish early-ish 90s, there was an animated TV series that was on Sky One that we used to love watching, and we started to get some of the comics. And then through that, and we had a tiny comic shop where I grew up in Swindon. I kind of discovered more indie comics. I went through a massive Aliens and Predator obsession when I was about 13, and used to get the Aliens magazine. It was like Dark Horse used to sort of serialize a lot of their graphic novels. There was another magazine they had called Total Carnage, which had like The Mask, and I think it was Army of Darkness and some other stuff. Manga Mania was another one, and that I sort of started to get into anime in a big way. And weirdly, I don't know where this came from, but my mum got me a subscription to Mad magazine when I was 12, because she was like, "Oh, I think you might like this. It's quite funny." And I think for at least 3 years, I used to get Mad magazine every month. And I used to love that as well, because they did a lot of like film parodies.
Yeah.
And there were so many different cartoonists.
Yeah, and that's been mentioned by Mark Jackson on the podcast before, and it's not one that I ever set eyes on when I was younger, so it's very intriguing. I definitely need to look into that.
Yeah. We used to get that sometimes too.
Yeah, it was amazing. It was really good.
Really good parody.
And and I think that kind of, from there I sort of got into a lot more indie comics. Like when I went to university in Bristol, they had Forbidden Planet, the big comic shop, and I don't think I'd ever seen so many graphic novels. And I started to collect Black Hole by Charles Burns, which is like a horror comic that's amazing. If you can get hold of it, it's absolutely brilliant. And Usagi Yojimbo by Stan Sakai is another big one. It's about a rabbit samurai, but it's all very historically accurate, so as well as having like Japanese myths and legends. But that was a great comic. And yeah, just everything since. I worked in a comic shop for about 3.5 years, so I had access to a lot of stuff.
Fully immersed.
Yes, yeah. I mean, even now I probably spend way too much money on like graphic novels and stuff, but I love like Japanese horror comics.
Brilliant.
Still everything, really.
That was my next question, was around what's out there in children's comics that you're particularly enjoying reading, but it doesn't have to be children's comics, could be adults comics as well. So we start with Jess. What are you reading at the moment that's really exciting you?
I think at the minute, one of my absolute favourites, and that I've been buying for all my son's friends whenever they have a birthday, is Starcat by James Turner and Yasmin Sheikh. I hope that's how I'm pronouncing her name. It's so funny, and it's just great. And the other one I'm quite into at the minute is Lucy Knisley, who's like an autobiographical comics artist. She's doing a kind of young adult series. It's got 2 books so far, Stepping Stones and Apple Crush, and they're really, really good. And I just got into another Japanese horror series called PTSD Radio, which is really
good title.
Really good. Yeah, it's all about this it's about a god of hair. So it's all this horror to do with like hair, and it's like, it's really creepy, and
it's freaking me out already. I've not even looked at it yet.
Yeah, because I love
like the ultimate bad hair day.
It's like, did you ever watch that film Peanut Butter Solution, where somebody's hair, like they go bald and then they put peanut butter solution on their hair, and their hair never stops growing. It's a 90s film, and their hair you have to like cart it around on a little.
Oh,
it is terrifying. It's like a proper 90s children's film. Look it up. It haunts me to this day. Mo, what about you? What's out there that you're interested in that's exciting you at the moment?
I always go for the funny. I'm not very good at horror, so I would be like, I'm one of those people that I can still imagine Stephen King stuff that I saw 30 years ago. It's still in my head. So I'm a bit of a chicken when it comes to horror stuff, but I love superhero stuff. I love interesting mashups. I picked up a mashup which was an old comic book, but it was like a Doctor Who, Star Trek mashup comic, which was fantastic. I love just finding weird things like that and going, oh, that's cool, that's interesting and funny. In graphic novels, I like the Inflatables, that series.
Oh yeah.
It's just about a bunch of abandoned inflatables in a pool. I just think that's really...
In fact, Jess and Beth, who wrote the Inflatables, is going to come on the podcast this season. Oh, yeah. So, I'm looking forward to chatting with them.
Yes, they are they're just both very funny individuals, anyway, so I think that's, yeah. So I love the funny. And I'm reading, and I'm terrible at names, but it's the graphic artist who's doing the graphic novel of Good Omens that's being done at the moment, and I can't think of her name, and she's from Philadelphia, where I'm from, and I'm totally blanking.
It's not Colleen
and I'm
Duran,
reading her.
Is it?
Oh, it might be.
I'm not sure.
I just started her graphic novel kind of autobiography, and that's really cool.
I'll have a little bit of a research, and I'll find out, I can say what it is at the end. Yeah. For anyone who is new to Agent Moose and the Agent Moose world, Mo, could you give us a little bit of an introduction to what people can expect to find when they open the cover? I have to say, I really, really enjoyed it. It was I enjoyed it, and it's been very popular in my house as well. My children have loved it too.
Oh, good. Oh, that's good to know. Thank you. Yeah, it's Agent Moose is a master of disguise. So he is a spy, but his kind of special, his special power is that he can disguise himself as anything. So he's disguised as a palm tree or a billboard or a giant turtle or whatever it is, and nobody seems to notice that there's this giant moose disguised as something ridiculous in the middle of a scene. And he's very self-confident, like very overly self-confident. So he's kind of the best worst super detective. And if it wasn't for Alfred, he really wouldn't solve many cases. But Alfred is his sidekick, and he is not so special, not quite so special agent. Alfred is, Agent Moose is special agent Moose, and he is not quite so special agent because he's still kind of in training. But he's very good. He's very good. And they're in the world of Big Forest, and lots of, there is an amazing amount of crime and shenanigans in Big Forest for just a general woodland area. Who would know?
It's a crime hotspot.
I know. So that's the world of Agent Moose, and his name, of course, is Anonymous. Agent Moose's real name is Anonymous.
Brilliant.
So he's an anonymous moose.
I love it. So how did your collaboration with Jess come about? Did you already know each other? Is it matchmaking from the publishers that's put you together? How does it work?
It's total matchmaking from the publishers, because I was working on the script. To backtrack a little, so I was working on the script for Agent Moose. But it wasn't Agent Moose back then. It was Anonymous when I first started writing it.
I love that.
And it was a graphic novel about an anonymous mouse who was a secret agent. And my agent just kind of read through it and went, you know what, just not funny enough, not quite good. And I put it in a drawer for a while, and I came back to it and went, Anonymous.
I love that transformation. That's such an interesting journey.
Yeah. Because you have like a little mouse, and a mouse is secretive, right? A mouse could be disguised in your house and you would never know it. But a 7-foot big brown furry moose, maybe you should notice that moose is there. So that kind of, and then as soon as that kind of came on board, the whole character came out, and Alfred the owl came out, and all kinds of things, and it kind of came together very quickly. And Flywell and Friends in the US said, we want to take this on. We want to make it into a graphic novel. Yay, fantastic. We have a couple of illustrators in mind. So I said, great, that's fantastic. And they sent me Jess's and a couple of other people's work. And Jess's work was just so funny.
Oh.
And again, like, I'm drawn to the funny, but Jess is just so funny.
Yeah.
It was, I don't know how other people make decisions about who, gets to illustrate, who is the person who's going to come on board and collaborate as the illustrator, because for me it was the funny. It was, I wasn't going, oh well, I think the artistic impression of this is it was just, her stuff is just hands down funny. So that's what you want hands down funny in the book.
Brilliant.
So it was a pretty easy gravitation towards Jess.
And Jess, do you remember what your initial sort of reaction was the first time you read an Agent Moose script? What pulled you into that?
I think it was, I just love drawing animals a lot. So it was like, it's about animals. It was like, yep, okay, you got me there. So that was the first bit. Yeah, and it was just really funny, and it was very easy to visualize as well. So it's like I could already kind of see the characters as I wanted to draw them. And I think there wasn't that much. I did some doodles and sent them off, and I think the only thing we really kind of changed a lot was Agent Moose's kind of suit. I think I had quite a clear idea of how I wanted to draw everyone, and there were so many good characters, so I got to draw lizards and barracudas and squirrels, so it was just, yeah, it was a lot of variation, and it seemed very fun. And as I was reading it, I could just immediately think of how I wanted to draw certain scenes, so that was, yeah, it was quite exciting.
Can you tell me just a little bit about the creative process as a collaboration? I'm really interested in when there's more than one person involved in a creative project, how that works, the kind of conversations. Did you do roughs and send them over, or were you ever in the same room, for example?
It's a weird one because for the most part, I do a lot of my own stuff. So with like the Phoenix, that's all me, and Super Dweeb is kind of, while I do collaborate with my editor and art director, it's very much you kind of just get on with it. Yeah. And it depends, really. There doesn't seem to be one process within the industry. Everybody's got their own ways of doing things. But with Agent Moose, it was very much, Mo wrote it like a script.
And was there much within that script in terms of what should end up in a panel, or was that quite open?
It was very open, actually. So I think I panicked a tiny bit when I saw it, because it's kind of like, it's quite an undertaking to put down a graphic novel, but our art director, Liz, was great. And basically we sort of went through and managed to break everything down into pages. And it actually worked out really nicely in terms of how many panels were on each page. So that made it a lot easier. And basically, once we got the character designs down, because I think it wasn't a really short deadline, but it was the kind of deadline where I was quite eager to get straight into it. So I kind of made thumbnails for myself just to get an idea of what was going on each page. And then I sort of went almost straight into the pencil stage, because I do work fairly quickly, and sent them off in batches. And basically any changes by then were quite easy to make, and it was a really smooth process. So as long as Mo was happy with everything, there would just be small tweaks. So it was actually quite a nice process. It was very just sort of easygoing, really. Everybody was really
on the same page. No pun intended.
Yeah. Yeah, so it felt very smooth, and yeah, it's sort of the pencils are the hardest part, like making sure everything flows okay. So as soon as all that was kind of okayed, it was just the kind of the next bit, which is the inking and the colouring, really. And I just have to give a shout out to my husband, John Paul Bove, because he took on nearly all of the colouring for Agent Moose.
Amazing.
I did some of the colouring, but for the most part, he was kind of picking up the pages and getting the bulk of that done. I think he did a great job.
And do you work digitally primarily? Is that how you create your artwork, or is there some kind of part of the stage which, you're saying pencils? Is it actually in pencil, or is it all sort of digital?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I do everything drawing on paper first. I find it really hard to go straight into like Photoshop or anything. I ink and colour in Photoshop, but yeah, I find it much easier to do everything by hand, and I just find I work a lot quicker that way as well. So even though you've got loads of scanning and stuff to do, but yeah, I do envy people who have managed to go completely digital. I find it really hard to see the screen as the paper size, so things end up being a bit all over the place if I try and go straight in. I just really like drawing everything first.
I mean, what do you think the sort of secret to that working successfully is in terms of that kind of partnership, writer and illustrator partnership?
I think there's just a trust. I really trusted Jess's intention, like she was going to make it funny, and it was going to be funnier because I would write something and then she would add in layers through the illustrations, and it just came out as a better book. You know what I mean? So there was just confidence that would happen. So anytime there was something like, "Ooh, could we change this to do this or whatever?" It was all very like there was no panic about it. It was like, "Yeah, of course, this is going to be amazing in the end." It's just we'll work through these things, and I don't know how she does it, but she does work remarkably fast. It would be like, "Oh yeah, we've got pencils for this." I was like, "Oh my god!" Yeah.
There you go, Jess. You could sit on things for a bit. You don't need to
I
just sandbag a bit.
I tend to do that. I think it's just I tend to work quite quick. Hopefully, it doesn't show in the quality of my work. But...
Of course not.
I think it's always a good sign when you're just newly cracking up at stuff. Like, I would have read the scripts for that a gazillion times because it would have gone through edits and everything before, and then I'll get the pencils back from Jess and I'll giggle at something completely different. They'll just be like, oh yeah, that's yeah. So I think that's the sign that it's going well, because something will just make me crack up a new like I'd never read it before.
That's a great sign. I just want to talk a little bit. One of the things that I think is really useful for any teachers listening is for them to have an idea of which child, not one child, obviously, hopefully more than one, that would be interested in reading this. That skill of being able to match the book to the reader is sort of really key for teachers in terms of developing reading for pleasure. So, Mo, I was wondering, when you were writing it, were you imagining a child of particular interest or something, anything like that, or an age group is useful as well? Just what did you have in your mind as the kind of reader?
I think I had kind of 7+ in my mind, but I've talked to, since then, tons of 6-year-olds who are Agent Moose obsessed. So it can go younger. And I think I had in mind, I always kind of write for, how would I have read this as a 7-year-old? So which I think is the only honest way to do it. I can't imagine what other kids are doing, so I can write for 7-year-old Mo. And if 7-year-old Mo cracks up, then that's a good sign. Mm-hmm. And I was aware as well of, my son is dyslexic and was a very reluctant reader. He's in university now and stuff. But that whole idea of grabbing, kids who are labeled reluctant readers, kids who are labeled as, oh, well, you're not into books. Well, that could just be that they haven't found a book that makes them laugh, And graphic novels are a great way in for kids that might, be reticent about other books. And funny books are a great way in. So if you can do a funny graphic novel, win-win.
Sure. So
I think kids that liked, kind of Dogman and Bunny versus Monkey and Investigators and all those, I think it's...
I completely agree. Yeah, it sits really well alongside those. I laughed lots reading it. My son read it before me, and we had a talk conversation where he was trying to tell me that Alfred was a pun. And I was like, no, Alfred's just a name. Alfred is the name, is a person's name. And then when I read it, I was like, oh no, sorry, it is a pun. I'm just going to climb down now from that.
No, Alfred is a genuine name, I'm sure.
Yes. Mo, I just wanted to ask you, I know that you've produced picture books before, and I'm just really interested in the kind of the differences between creating something like that's a graphic novel format compared to, a picture book, and the differences in that kind of process for you.
Yeah, I think it's really different. I feel like a picture book is, for me, writing a poem. It's that you have to be that precise with your words. There are so few words that you have to be like, no, those 2 words aren't serving any purpose, so they're gone, or this isn't forwarding anything. So as a writer, it's a different thing. Writing the graphic novel felt really at home to me because I used to be an actor and I used to write scripts. So writing it as a script felt like going back to what I did before I wrote books. So it actually just felt like a really natural thing, writing a script and writing all the dialogue and everything in a graphic novel. A picture book has less dialogue generally, and it's just so precise. So it was a very different skill set for my writing. As far as the collaborating with illustrators, I don't feel like I had that much collaboration in the picture books because it was kind of just turned over to the illustrator, and then it was kind of between the illustrator and the art director and the editor. And it wasn't as collaborative. It was very much like handing over and then seeing and then coming back. So it's an interesting process, both like a totally different process for writing, and I think way different for the illustrator too, because imagine Jess is looking at this very cinematically and she's like building up the panels and it's very because Jess has worked on picture books too, so I imagine it's a different process from her point of view. Is that right?
Yeah, I haven't worked on that many picture books, to be honest. I've worked on a lot of activity books and stuff. I wanted to get into picture books when I was sort of in uni and left uni, but I don't know, I could never quite get into working that way. It always ended up being more like comics.
Yes.
Weirdly, but yeah, it does feel like a very different process.
Yeah,
I think with sort of comics and graphic novels, I think you have to have that kind of level of back and forth, really, because there's so much to it.
And like when you're writing your script, do you have thoughts in your head about that, what that's going to look like when you're writing?
I did have thoughts in my head, but I didn't kind of want to impose those thoughts because I thought, well, Jess is a visual person, so Jess is like, I didn't think it would be helpful if I wrote, and then you have a close-up of Agent Moose growling or something, you know, like, I thought it's like too prescriptive. I mean, Jess is going to have her own vision of this. And if there was something that I was like, oh my God, no, that's not what I would have thought, but there really wasn't. I mean, I think of it as a film when I'm writing it. So I think in a way of, you know, there's a big establishing shot and then there are close-ups and mid shots and stuff. And Jess does all that. And I think as we kind of got a pattern, like once book 1 was done, as I was writing book 2, I was kind of writing like, okay, the beginning of this chapter, there'll be this kind of establishing shot. And I kind of thought of it that way as I was writing it, because that was kind of the pattern that we fell into with the pattern that was created for book 1. So I kind of thought of it more following those sequences in book 2 as I was writing it. I could picture like, oh, okay, this is, you know, she might do this or she might do this.
So it's rather than directing it, you're kind of predicting.
Well, I think, yeah.
As for the first one, it was really like everything in the air because there wasn't even a prediction. It was just like, well, we know what the characters look like and we love the characters. So then it's, how are you going to, I didn't feel like it was my place to kind of step on Jess's creativity because she's going to come up with something independently that's funnier and layer that on top of the lines, then that's going to make it better than me trying to prescribe something I think would be visually funny, you know?
It's such a great combo. I love this. Sounds amazing. Sounds like a perfect partnership. I'd love to explore a little bit how you came to be a writer, Mo, and illustrator, Jess, and the role that education played in that. I think it's really useful to hear, you know, positive and negative experiences of early years. I
had a very good and bad. So I talked about before, I had a varied story diet, and that was encouraged. And I don't think people took comic books out of my hand as a kid, which I know a lot of people have had that experience of, where they're like, no, don't read that. That's a waste of your time or whatever. So I was very lucky that I didn't have that. Teachers weren't taking comic books out of my hand, or my parents weren't taking comic books out of my hand, or, you know, books that were deemed lower than my reading age or whatever. I feel like we don't go around reading Proust just because we're capable of reading Proust. We want to read stuff that's different sometimes.
Exactly.
So, So I the whole reading levels thing. I've had kids come up and say, "Oh, I'd really love to read your book, but it's on the red shelf, and now I'm on blue."
Yeah,
it's like, okay. So for teachers out there, please let kids read stuff off the lower shelves, please, because they might just want to have fun, and that's okay.
Yeah.
So I think I was lucky with that. I was never tested for dyslexia, and it was only when my son was tested that I kind of thought, oh, you know what, I do some of those things. And I always had processing problems as far as remembering sequences and in my handwriting. My spelling was terrible as a kid. It still isn't great. And my handwriting was terrible. And so I did have some teachers, not all teachers. I had some amazing teachers. Some teachers tell me, oh, well, then you can't be a writer because you can't spell and your handwriting's terrible. And then, you know, I discovered this wonderful thing called spell check. Like, oh, from the heavens, and kind of went, oh yeah, I can do this. But it took until I was in my 30s. Not that time was wasted, because I became an actor, and I think that really informed my writing as well. I was storytelling in other ways.
Yeah.
And that was all very encouraged. Like I said, I had people that encouraged me to be the narrator in a play, to tell a story, to write my own stuff, but to speak it, you know. So I did have a lot of encouragement. And I think sometimes for kids, that's a great asset. Hearing your work read aloud is really amazing. When I go into workshops and stuff and I'm, you know, working with kids, I always like to say, can I read this out loud? Because this is a really funny bit, or this is a really, you know, intense bit, suspenseful bit. And how the kid reacts to hearing his peers or her peers hear something read really strongly. It means a lot to them. I think that hearing that work read out loud is really affirming and makes you think,
Yeah.
oh, I can do this. And they think to themselves, oh, it does sound good when you read a good book.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, that's really powerful. And Jess, what about you? How did you come to be an illustrator? You mentioned at university. What was your journey and what role did your early education have in that?
I can always just remember drawing, and yeah, school was actually pretty good. I've always been a big reader, and I was always any excuse to draw, and all through school that was fine. It was weirdly, when I got to university, the course I was on, it was a really great illustration course, but they were really against comics.
That's interesting.
Yeah, they tended to push you more towards traditional illustration. They just didn't seem to like comics for some reason, and a few people I spoke to had mentioned that. So yeah, that was really strange. And I went to art college after school before I went to uni, and that was I did a lot of comic-based work. So yeah, it was a bit of an odd one at uni. I still loved my experience there, and I mean, my work is so far removed.
I was just going to ask you, did you have, because you've got a very distinctive style, when did that start to form? Was that, so obviously not at university from what you're saying a bit later on?
Yeah, I think it's always been, because I got into self-publishing when I worked in the comic shop. We had like a small press that they were very keen on getting like self-published stuff in, and I started to do more. I got into publishing mostly through doing a lot of activity books, and then it was the first year I went completely self-employed. I'd had a really busy year, and I think it was like 2012, and then 2013, the year I decided to be self-employed, I had nothing coming in, and it was like, oh my God, what have I done? And I just started to do some little comics for myself to self-publish. I put them in a little book called May Contain Shark, and I just ended up sending off a few of them to the Phoenix, and they replied, and it was just like, oh.
Amazing.
Yeah, it kind of went from there. But it hasn't been a completely smooth road.
Yeah.
I think I just started, like I say, self-publishing, because I was like, well, I kind of, at least I've got control over what I put out.
Yeah.
And I was still contacting publishers, but that really helped. That seemed to be the kind of push into comics.
Did you sell those through comic shops and through like comics festivals and things like that?
Yeah, me and my husband have been doing comic cons for years, so that was really good. And you pick up stuff from other people, and you just realise how much awesome stuff is out there. And yeah, I think it just really helped, because I think I was doing the kind of work that I wanted to read, and it was great. Yeah, I owe a lot to self-publishing, really. It really sort of helped me, just sort of develop my style and the kind of stuff I wanted to do.
Oh, that's brilliant.
So, not that, I mean, like I say, I loved my uni experience, but yeah.
You found your own voice a bit more when you're sort of out on your own.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think working in a comic shop definitely helped as well, because like I say, I had access to, I'd never seen so much manga in one place, because when I was a teenager, like Waterstones had about 4 manga books.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was just so nice to have everything.
And Mo shared some of her learnings or things that she's picked up from doing school visits there. Is that something that you've done a lot of, visiting schools, doing sessions with children? Do you find that a useful thing to do?
Oh, no, I love it. I really love doing workshops in schools. I haven't done as many in the last few years, sort of given the pandemic and everything, but it's so much fun, and the kids are always so enthusiastic. And one thing I definitely try and do in my work, and that I have to remember to do when I'm working with kids, is not underestimate them, because God, they're so funny. So they're really clever and everything, and it's like my son will come out with things, and it's just like amazing. And it's so nice to be able to work with them on like comics and stuff, and like the Phoenix Fest that we did in April. That was so much fun, just because the kids are great. They're just up for everything. The stuff they come out with is just amazing, and you're kind of like, oh God, these are going to be such talented people. And yeah, it's really, really nice. And I'm hoping to start, I've been talking to my son's head teacher about doing an art club in their school. So fingers crossed that'd
be brilliant.
That'll happen, because it's just and I think I would have loved that as a kid. We didn't really have anything like that. We didn't have people coming in, especially artists. We didn't have anything like that, and I just know that would have made a massive difference to me as well.
Acknowledge it, like some of the kids are shy about sharing their drawings. And then you see these kids doing these epic creations. You know, they're drawing their own little superhero character or something. And then they have, you know, sketchbooks full of really cool stuff. And it's amazing to kind of just see the creativity. That's brilliant character. I want to see that in a bookshop in 10 years.
Yeah, I think it's being able to encourage as well. You'll get some children who'll be like, oh, how do you draw so well? My stuff's not very good at all. And I'm like, look, you're 10, I'm 43. I've had a lot of practice, you know, and it's like, if you're drawing like you are now, you're only going to get better. Yeah. And your stuff, you know, you're going to find different inspiration that you draw from, and your work's going to change. It doesn't have to be perfect straight away. And it's. I think it's the same with reading as well. It's like Mo was saying, you know, if kids want to just read stuff, they should just read it, and it's getting not be held
kids
back.
That say they can't write, and then I get them to create. You know, I'll draw like a 4-panel thing on it, and we create sort of a 4-panel comic strip as part of one of the workshops I do. And they'll write dialogue. You know, they'll come up with really funny dialogue in the word bubbles. Oh, no, but I can't write. No, you just wrote a whole scene.
Yeah.
You literally wrote a whole scene. Look at this. This is really funny. This is, you know. So just going, oh, maybe I can write. It's like, yeah, you can. You can do this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think comics is one of those things, because it's very different to a lot of the types of writing that's done in school. It is a real chance for children to get stories out that they struggle to with in other more traditional forms of writing. So you get those really wow moments where they like surprise themselves.
Yeah, and I love kind of big graphic novels and stuff as well when some people go, oh, but I'd really love for the kids to move on. And I'm thinking, well, you know, I know plenty of adults who read mostly graphic novels.
Yeah, I haven't moved on.
Yeah.
And look at us now, we're so successful. I'm just adding myself into your success there. So at the end of the podcast, I always ask guests to kind of pick out a couple of key points, takeouts, or things that they want educators to be thinking about as they finish listening to this episode of the podcast. I don't know, any takers? Who wants to start? Anything could be a summary of stuff we've already discussed, or something maybe you haven't had a chance to say yet. Up to you.
You know, a lot of creativity comes from lots of different places, really. And, you know, I think, like Mo was saying, you know, having good selections of books and comics that just hits on different interests for different children. And, you know, someone who, like Mo was saying, might not want to read a wall of text. Suddenly they've got, like, you know, Agent Moose or Investigators or something like that would, you know, perhaps
pique their interest.
But be the way into maybe tackling the books that they're a bit more daunted by.
No, I totally agree. And I think, I don't know if you guys, do you know Daniel Pennick, The Rights of the Reader? Have you come across that?
Yeah.
Beautifully illustrated version by Quentin Blake. But those, you know, I really think that should be like in every classroom. There's posters of that, and encourage kids to kind of take books at their own pace and dabble, and that's okay. If a book isn't floating your boat,
finish it.
Put it down. I mean, because I've had conversations with kids where they're like, "Ooh, but what if I don't like it? Then I have to read it all the way through." And it just means that the kid who reads the football books will just continue to always read the football books. The kid who reads the pony books will just continue to read the pony books. And if you like as in Jess said, have a varied spectrum of different types of books and different types of stories, you know, fact stories and fiction stories and mixed up bits of both, and, you know, picture books for older kids and graphic novels and everything. It's letting the kids dabble and see what they want. And I think that's fair. And I also think it's, you know, mashups are valid. And I've had kids who've kind of said, oh, but I want to write my own book about Spider-Man. And I'm like, do it. I think that's a fantastic way to do it, because you're taking a character that you know really well. So you don't have to worry about the character. Yeah. It's like doing a masterclass in plotting and world building, because you have this existing character. You're just going to concentrate on the plot. And then you could say, I'm going to write my own story in the Star Trek universe or whatever. Okay, so you've got that world building. Now you're going to put new characters into it. I think it's a really useful tool, and it's a really valid way of just concentrating on one aspect of your writing and honing it.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, I think that's a great flag. Thank you for both of those. So the final thing that we do on the podcast is if we were to add one comic or book about comics to our to be read piles tomorrow, what would you recommend us to add to our list? But you're only allowed to choose one. There's been some absolute flaunting of the rules on this, so I'm having a crackdown for season 3. One book that you would recommend people check out.
Okay, I've got one. It's not necessarily a kid's
That's okay.
graphic novel. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
It's Hey Wait by Jason. He's done quite a few books, and Hey Wait was the first one I ever read of his, and it is just the most devastating graphic novel, and it's fantastic, and I love it.
I have not heard of that. Thank you so much for that. And Mo, have you got one to recommend us?
I would go for the inflatables, because again, I'm just going for the funny. If it makes me crack up, yeah, I think if you're a kid and you haven't picked up the inflatables yet, they're really funny. So
yeah, they are really funny, and loads of puns as well in there.
I'm all about
funny language play.
Puns. I'm all about the puns. And I found out the author of the book that I was talking about. It's Shelley.
Oh yeah.
Shelley Bond, and she's
Shelley Bond.
Yeah, and the book is called Fast Times in Comic Book Editing, and it's her bio, and it's really cool. It's it also really goes into the comic book making process, like back in the 90s.
Cool.
Which is really cool. She talks about kind of physically having to do things, and she was an assistant editor for a while and schlepping things around and scissors and
that's brilliant.
Carving knives and doing things. So yeah, interesting.
That sounds really good. Thank you so much for those recommendations. And thank you both for coming on the podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure to chat with you. Thank you very much for spending time talking to me.
Oh, no, I thought it's been lovely.
Yeah, thank you for having us. It's been fab.
There you have it. That was such a fun conversation, and just brilliant to have both creators there at the same time talking from their different perspectives. As I mentioned in the episode, next week we have another creative duo, and it's one that Mo O'Hara actually recommended. The writing duo, Beth Garrett and Jess Hitchman behind the Inflatables series that Mo talked about, will actually be joining us on the podcast next week. It's a really good conversation and a little bit of a different perspective, thinking about how writing can be done in collaboration, building on some of the themes that Helen Jones spoke about in episode 3 of the podcast. It's really coming together as a nice strand through this series of the podcast, so I'm really looking forward to that. If you haven't had a chance to check out the Agent Moose series yet, please do. It's really fun and engaging, and definitely something that would go down well in any primary classroom or library. Now, this weekend, it is Lakes International Comics Art Festival. We're heading towards the final weekend in September, if you're listening to this podcast at another time. And I'm really excited to be going up to the festival, my first time at the festival. Going to be catching up with lots of past guests from the podcast. Gemma Sosnowski is going to be there, Hester Harrington, Hattie Earle, Mark Jackson, Emma Reynolds, Sarah Begum. Lots and lots of past guests from the podcast, and hopefully lots of future guests of the podcast too. I will be on the hunt for more people to come on the podcast in future seasons as well. Thanks to everyone who has reached out and shared love for the podcast. We've had a great start to the season in terms of people listening in and commenting. I've had some lovely messages as well. A lovely message on Instagram, our growing Instagram. Thanks to everyone who's followed this week on Instagram. Keep on following on @comic_boom_podcast. Going to be putting a lot more content on there as we go. Hoping to do some Instagram stories, because I'm fancy, from the Lakes International Comics Art Festival this weekend as well. Brian Mapson got in touch on Instagram to say he's really enjoying the podcast. He's only recently discovered it, but he's found every episode really informative, thought-provoking and entertaining. Thank you, Brian. That was brilliant to receive. It really keeps me going on the long nights of editing, so thank you very much. My recommendation this week, I'm going to relate it to Jess actually. Talked at the start there about her day in the life of Apu, Gnu and You, which is a brilliant book. And I just love the work that Jess has done in non-fiction comics for children. And a while ago now, I was sent some books published by Wayland called Comic Strip Science, and they're written by Paul Mason and illustrated by Jess, and very much in the same vein, and just really fun, engaging way to learn about science. There's lots of different versions. We've got physics, earth and space and so on, and just a nice way to build your non-fiction comics collections. I thought perfect for primary age children, and a good one to check out if you haven't heard of them before. That's it for this week. Thanks to everyone who has tuned in. You can write a review to support the podcast. You can get in touch on Instagram or on Twitter. I'm on @Lucy_Bradley and find out what's happening on the podcast there as well. If you want to support the podcast, you can buy me a comic or buy one of my comics on kofi.com/LucySB. That's ko-fi.com/LucySB. Kofi.com is also a great place to link up with comics creators and buy direct from them, people who are doing small press publishing like me. There's lots of different, you can kind of follow people on there. So it's a good resource to check out generally as well. And you can see some of my work on there as well if you are interested. Thank you so much for your support of the podcast. Hope you found this episode interesting. You've been listening to Comic Boom, produced and hosted by Lucy Starbuck Bradley. That's me. Thanks for listening.